that was an awesome introduction. I just want to say thank you to the NJ PTA. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, so just if I stumble, please excuse me. I think before I get into the presentation, I want to highlight a little bit about who we are. A lot of that in the introduction, I think, gets to the point I was about to make, but we approach this work primarily from the paradigm of policy and how we can produce efficacy, more so than how can we create a business framework that we think is very interesting. And I know that sounds a little bit astounding, but we view ourselves as a team of advocates that started the process with the whiteboard and looked towards creating a policy framework that we thought would work, and then figuring out how to build a business model that could allow that policy framework to scale. That makes us a little bit different, and I'll get into some of what we do later in the presentation. But next slide. I want to talk a bit about micromobility, what it means, and why it's relevant as we think about the next chapter in our transportation landscape future. So micromobility is a term that I think is thrown around quite a bit. It's a term that's about 4.5 years old. It actually comes from Europe, and it's an attempt to kind of encapsulate this growing field of small mobility vehicles that are under 100 pounds, usually under 50 pounds, that tend to go between 0 and 30 miles an hour, right? Typically 25 or under. So what does that look like? It looks like the traditional bicycle. The bicycle is the OG of micromobility, but it also increasingly looks like e-bikes, scooters and e-scooters, skateboards and one wheels. And there's some other form factors that we're seeing on our city streets that, the Segway, for example, right? Things that are small, things that don't move as quickly as our as our larger vehicular counterparts, but are designed primarily for short and medium range trips. And then also we have to include our mobility as a service operators as well, bike share, scooter share. We're seeing an increasing array of subscription services and flexible ownership models where you can buy a bike or rent a bike or rent a scooter for a period of months and then return it for a monthly fee. And then bike parking infrastructure, obviously we fall into that latter category. Next slide. So who does micromobility serve? And I found that in our conversations with advocates and with cities, there's this kind of, and especially with the media, actually, there's a massive misperception that exists. That micromobility, that bikes, that scooters primarily serve affluent, white, middle-aged men. And that's actually not true. So typically we do find that working class folks, immigrants, and minority folks are more likely to ride bikes and to ride and take advantage of micromobility. Generally in America as a whole, immigrants are 2 times more likely to bike. And those earning less than $35,000 and living within a dense residential area such as northern New Jersey are 10 times as likely to use a bike. We do find that micromobility continues to skew towards men, and there are a few reasons we think that contribute to that reality. But generally speaking, the actual constituency of micromobility is much more diverse and much more nuanced than folks might think. So here we have on the right, a picture of a deliverista. New York City has 80,000 delivery workers, the majority of whom are working class, the majority of whom are Black and brown and Asian, and many of whom are immigrants and folks who are even ESL, English as a second language. As we have a conversation regionally about bike infrastructure, these folks bear the brunt of our bike infrastructure deficit. And that's something that as policymakers, we have to keep in mind as we continue to advance this conversation. Next slide. I think as we talk about what micromobility is, what the potential is, we have to understand that this is really the fastest growing segment of transportation in America right now, and it's not really even close. So A lot of the statistics that I'm going to cite are from New York City, because New York City just is a nationwide leader in just releasing data. But a lot of these trends are true for our northern New Jersey municipalities as well. So 700% increase in cycling since the year 2000. We've seen e-bike sales over the past 2 years really surge, especially during the course of the pandemic. And we've seen municipalities, New York City and beyond, really commit to robust bike lane growth, right? I'm not going to necessarily say bike infrastructure, but bike lanes, right? How do we create on-street space that can accommodate these new mobility form factors? Next slide. And as we think about why this is so important, there are a few reasons, but I think the most important things to highlight here about why micromobility can really be helpful to a city of any size, foremost primarily is traffic congestion. 50% of domestic car trips are under 3 miles, 20% are under 1 mile. And here in New York and northern New Jersey, we've got a real transportation traffic crisis where our streets are clogged. We've seen the rise of ride hailing really contribute to on-street congestion. Now, if we can just get half of the people who are making trips under 3 miles to convert over to micromobility, then the dividends will actually benefit not only people who are drowning in traffic in public transportation, on buses, but also drivers, people who are going beyond 3 miles, who take longer trips, are emergency workers, people in ambulances. So we're going to see dividends across the playing field, whether you are calling 911 because someone you know is having an emergency, or whether you are taking a cross-state trip, or whether you're on a bus looking to go across town. Migrating over those trips to more efficient forms of transportation is something that will really benefit cities as a whole. You can see here a famous diagram which compares a bus, 60 people on a bus, 60 people on bikes versus 60 people in cars. I think what people fail to realize about micromobility is that, it's spatially very close to public transportation. The second reason I want to highlight is transportation integration. So research tells us that micromobility boosts a catchment area of transit by about 200%. So if you've got a subway station, if you've got a commuter rail hub, people can walk to that station. Let's say they're willing to walk 4 blocks. If they bike, or if they scoot, or if they use a one wheel, it can be 12 blocks or more, right? And so we're looking at a much larger zone of efficacy for our transportation facilities, our public transportation facilities, excuse me. And finally, an improved passenger experience and access, access paradigm for public transit. We find that in other cities, particularly London, showing up with your bike or with your scooter and then having to drag it on the train because there's not a place to put it is something that is considered a real friction point. So having these kinds of facilities at transit hubs can really lead to a better passenger experience. Next slide. Now, I think when we talk about micromobility and where we're headed, we have to kind of leave behind our old paradigms. So what is micromobility not meant to encapsulate? Recreational rides, traditionally rides to the park, a fun lifestyle amenity. I think you've got folks who are, for whatever reason, they think in the confine, often developers, of micromobility as a nice kind of fun thing to do to get around the neighborhood, or a really cool economic way to attract young people to a certain space, right? You hear this in the context of bids often. I used to work for a bid, or a SID as you call it in New Jersey. We can have some bike lanes, and if we have bike lanes, we can attract millennials, or we can attract Gen Z. I prefer to view micromobility as a form of public transportation that's no different than car trip or highway or a transit line, and that is a fundamentally different paradigm than how we used to look at bikes and scooters and that bundle excuse me, that bundle of mobility options. Next slide. Excuse me. So I want to talk briefly about trends that we're seeing, and then some bit about our work, and then some recommendations that I have to mull over for the group. Part of the reason why we think that micromobility is going to continue to grow and is on pace to account for 1 out of 5 urban trips is because we're still seeing strong municipal investment in cities across the board domestically. We're seeing cities invest not only in bike lanes, but bike share, and we're seeing cities release fairly progressive bike master plans that are mapping out the next decade of how we're building the bike network. So I think 4 years ago, the conversation was, is micromobility a fad? Given the track record of investment we're seeing, it's clearly not a fad. We're clearly going to see robust growth and a strong adoption curve going into the future. Next slide. We're also seeing the private sector, particularly our friends in venture in Silicon Valley, really invest billions of dollars into private operators, both on the mobility as a service side, but also increasingly on the OEM side. And this is a really, really stark difference from basically anywhere before 2015. So prior to 2015, micromobility companies were largely existent, in the exception of Motivate, which ran City Bike, largely confined to recreation, largely confined to sport, and largely confined to lifestyle. And then, when the first bike share companies started to really take root, Silicon Valley noticed and started pouring in billions of dollars. And now we're thinking largely in the terms of building public transportation and expanding access to casual adopters. And that's really transformed, as many of you know, what we think the options could be for our communities. We have companies that are pretty well funded, willing to come in and loss lead, and I'll get to that in a minute, willing to come in and loss lead in our communities and create basically a form of public transportation. Next slide. So what are the friction points that we're seeing as we really enter the next chapter in this micromobility revolution? We have a strong focus on safety. I think policy-wise, when you look at any bike master plan, when you hear DOTs in northern New Jersey or beyond present, oftentimes the conversation is centered on how we can make cycling or using a bike or scooter safe in the urban context. Now, I'll be provocative for a second. I live in Brooklyn. No one rides the subway in Brooklyn and says, it was really safe this morning. No one flies in a plane and says, my flight was safe. Safety is a necessary but hardly sufficient foundation to which a competitive mode of transportation can be built. So we need to start thinking about bikes and scooters as real public transportation and to develop a paradigm of services and experiences around that make it not only safe, but convenient, competitive, and reliable. Now, to that end, limited parking, limited service opportunities. Here in New York City, because we have virtually no secure bike parking, and this is true in northern New Jersey as well, bike theft is rampant. 1 out of every 4 households in New York City has experienced bike theft. In cities like Montreal, 1 out of every 2 cyclists has experienced bike theft. 7% of people who experience bike theft actually don't replace their bikes. So as we think about the saliency of that challenge, people who already bike, when you ask them why they don't bike more, it's because there's no secure parking. When you think about servicing these bikes and scooters, where you have a car, you drive, you know that having gas stations, having dealerships, having places you can take your car when it breaks down, that ecosystem is really critical. But for those of us who own and use our own bikes and scooters, which is 95% of the market, you're in the Wild West, right? We are still operating in terms of our service capacity, very much like an optional lifestyle, recreational kind of transportation mode, and not like a everyday, I must use this to get to work kind of transportation mode. Unsustainable economic models for micromobility operators. So to be blunt, when you talk to folks in the mobility and service sector, they're all pretty candid about the fact that their companies aren't making any money. and they're in a environment right now which allows them to loss lead, and that that financing is going to dry up pretty soon. And so for those cities that see dividends and benefits to be gained from having private sector operational partners to provide micromobility services, how do we keep those private sector partners alive and well so they can continue to be above water and viable? And then lack of comprehensive transportation planning. So, going back to the first point, if we're thinking about this ecosystem as being ancillary to the form of transportation that we're hoping to see metastasize in our communities, how do we paradigm shift so that we are thinking about the holistic experience of those who use bikes and scooters, not just can they arrive safely? Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about what we do, and before I talk about some of the recommendations I have and take some questions. Uni is an attempt to think holistically about bike infrastructure and to tackle parking and service. So, back in 2016, we noticed that people who are friends, people who were in the downtown Brooklyn community, kept on having their bikes stolen. I had 3 bikes stolen over a period of 5 years. And as someone who, I live 2 miles away from my job, cycling was perfect in terms of a transportation option for me to get around, but it wasn't really viable if I couldn't park confidently. And we discovered that there really was no turnkey model for how to provide this infrastructure to urban communities. So we have OEMs like Darrow, Bike Fixation, Cycle Hoop in England, that sell infrastructure to vendors and they walk away. But the needs are so much greater than that. So we take on advocacy, we take on planning, we take on design, we take on financing, and then we take on operations so that cities can have a scalable turnkey solution to this infrastructure. And we're much more like an intersection of JC2Co, where we operate the solution in partnership with our urban partners, rather than say an OEM, which just basically manufactures and then walks away from the deal after they sell. So we actually don't sell to cities. We look for the right to operate, and we use advertising and sponsorship revenue to support the infrastructure. Next slide. We launched 3 stations in the New York, New Jersey area, 1 in Jersey City, 1 in downtown Manhattan, 1 in downtown Brooklyn. And we are working with a variety of partners to build out the next 45 in 2022 and beyond. And the goal is to get to a regional network. Transportation in New York, New Jersey is regional. Can we have a transportation system that is also regional, right? And we're seeing consolidation with Omni. We're seeing the MTA, the Port Authority, New Jersey Transit start to think about how we can have a common fare payment experience. That should also be true with micromobility infrastructure. We're also working domestically with cities such as Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Seattle, Miami, and Portland. Next slide. We envision our infrastructure to be much more than just bike parking. Eventually, we want to offer services through an app experience that can use the bike infrastructure as a fulfillment nodes in the network. So if you need a tune-up, you park your bike, you go to work, you go home, you can use our app to connect with a local bike shop. That bike shop can come to the asset where your bike is stationed, unlock your bike, tune it up on site, and put it back, and then you can return and ride your bike and have a fresh tune-up experience. This is really critical because right now, as I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to find a uniform service delivery model in this transportation space. It would be unthinkable if your car broke down and you called AAA and they said, sorry, we are only around Mondays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Otherwise, you're going to tow it yourself, right? There is always someone there to help you when you're in a vehicle. There's always someone there to help you when you're in public transportation. We need to find that same sort of companion concierge experience for micromobility. Next slide. Part of our model is working closely with advocacy groups, elected officials, and sort of grassroots community-based actors to build support for this kind of infrastructure. We found that in many of our target markets, frankly, there's a lot of trepidation, at DOTs in taking this on. We have to kind of articulate in concert with, our neighbors, why this infrastructure is not just needed, but is a priority. And so, we're proud of the fact that here in New York, we've been, enthusiastically supported by the incoming mayor. We're actually hosting an event with him next week, but also by mayoral candidates in the city council. We've worked closely with every major advocacy group in the region. And so that's very much part of our model. Next slide. So, as I conclude, I have several recommendations to think about how we can get to the future we need, where we can really provide a viable alternative to cars and vehicular trips. One is, there's been a really strong cohort of bike master plans. I think Jersey City is a really excellent one. For example, as cities start to contemplate how we can, what their bike master plan is going to look like, one of the things that's really near and dear to us is starting from scratch and thinking about the user experience. And that starts with data collection. So focus groups, who are users, who bikes, who doesn't bike. We need to have both of them. So the folks who bike, what would make you bike more often? What are the pain points you experience? The folks who don't bike or don't use micromobility, what would allow you to consider this as an option? Start with the data collection and design your bike master plan around a ground-up data collection apparatus. Expanded master plans that include not just bike lanes, but parking, service, and mobility operators. So, for example, here in New York City, one of our recommendations to the city government is we've got concessions on the Hudson River Greenway and the East River Greenway for restaurants. The city has accepted that our retail footprint in New York is so expensive that at some of our top tier destinations, it's going to be acceptable to have a Shake Shack that we rent out to Shake Shack or a local food purveyor. We should take that same approach with bike shops. Have city-sponsored concessions along major bike routes in kiosks that can provide services and have rules set aside for their operating hours and have cheap rent so they can afford to stay in business. We've seen this model employed in Los Angeles and San Francisco with their transportation networks with bike hubs. We think it'd be very successful here. Citywide RFPs that merge bicycle and scooter share. So here in northern New Jersey and New York City, we're one of the few places in America where bike and scooter share can subsist on sponsorship revenue and or nominal investments from from cities. We think that we should start to look at combining bike and scooter share and having joint RFPs for those kinds of services, primarily because these companies aren't sustainable and will need to be able to tap into additional sources of revenue, particularly that advertising and sponsorship revenue, in order to stay afloat. And then finally, city bike parking, municipal bike parking incorporated into street furniture paradigm. So, excuse me, here in New York and in northern New Jersey, traditionally, bus shelters, New York has 3,500 bus shelters. We have 400 newsstands. We have 1,700 Lincoln YCs. We have 1,000 city bike stations. We have ads on trash cans. So starting to think about bike parking facilities of all sizes in the context of that street furniture paradigm, that protected class of street furniture assets that we can allow sponsorship revenue to help offset. And again, this particular market is one of the few in this country where that model is viable, and using that revenue stream to take advantage of this new generation of infrastructure, and then to catalyze micromobility growth as a whole. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm, again, just recovering from a cold, and I look forward to your questions.
That was an amazing presentation. And I can think of so many places where I've traveled where that would be just wonderful to have that type of mobility. But let's open the floor. Do we have, Ted, do we have any questions in the chat box? I thought I saw, yeah, 2 questions.
Yes, that's correct. 2 questions. Somerset County, Ken Wadeen from Somerset County asked whether your expansion plans include expanding into less dense areas like downtowns, main streets in New Jersey suburbs, the older suburbs of the region.
Ideally, they would. I mean, we operate in partnership with cities as they make space available. So generally, the approach we advocate for is for cities to release an RFP, like you release an RFP for any city service, with a bundle of rights attached for advertising and sponsorship, et cetera. And that allows us to present a plan and allows other people to present a plan, which can be duly adopted by that particular municipality. So, you know, right now we haven't seen less dense areas take that action. We've only seen Jersey City, and I believe Hoboken is considering it, and New York City is considering it. Take that step. That's our recommendation. And that, again, it requires a bit of a paradigm shift, because that's how we typically approach street furniture and programs in other types of service provisions. So migrating that approach here.
Another question from Trevor Howard, City of Newark, kind of a 2-part question. What role has venture capital played in the growth of micromobility, and has venture capital artificially inflated its popularity, then expects government to subsidize the programs when the venture capital runs out?
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. So starting with that second part first, I'm just going to give my opinion. You know, I think when you look at the trend lines, micromobility was already growing prodigiously well before venture capital got involved. So starting in the year 2000, and then, you know, up until the year 2015, we didn't see venture capital play a really strong role in cultivation. You know, Bixie started in Montreal back in 2005, City Bike started in 2013. None of these were really venture capital backed endeavors. What we saw happen, you know, with venture capital was bike share in China took off, and that was a big bubble. And I think a lot of folks have forgotten that. But bike share in China took off, and Blue Go-Go, Lime, and a few companies here were going to emulate that model. And looking to what happened in China, venture capital saw a way to scale up bike share sans infrastructure. So City Bike, you know, the first generation of bike share systems had a really strong infrastructure presence. They were entrepreneurs that convinced investors that basically, if you just kind of leave bikes on the sidewalk, that could be a way to see really aggressive scale that could produce 100x returns, and forego the traditional downside. I say that with you know, with quotation marks, of working with government, working with communities, and dealing with infrastructure. All the things that provide value. So I don't think it was an artificial inflation. I think it was venture capital coming in and seeking to co-opt really strong trends and seeing the co-opt excitement and growth that we've already saw. That being said, the model of basically dumping bikes and scooters on city streets and circumnavigating local government, local communities, was never sustainable. For context, no public transit agency, I believe, no public transit system, I believe, in the country makes a profit. It's a very challenging space to make a profit. The airlines don't make a profit. They get bailed out every 10 years or so. You know, companies that make a profit in the space, if you think about, you know, the MRT in Hong Kong, for example, they profit on real estate. They don't profit on transit directly. So there are indirect opportunities to derive revenue and derive profit, but providing public transit as a whole is not a great way to do that. And so if the model for rideshare barely worked, Uber and Lyft still don't make any money really, then the model for you know, basically dumping a scooter or a bike on the ground and trying to back your way into a strong business case was never really going to work. That scooter often only lasts 4 months, and the battle now is can make it last 6 months. But even if you break even, it still doesn't make it interesting. So having spoken to a lot of folks in the industry, I think what the hope is that these programs, these companies can generate enough efficacy where they get to, at some point they get to a city and they say, look, we're a strong part of the transportation landscape in your city. Is there a way that we can work out a subsidy? And I think that for bike share, that's not actually far-fetched. We've seen cities, of all sizes subsidize bike share, right? We've seen Boston, we've seen San Francisco subsidize bike share. So they're looking, I think, to follow that model. The big question is, will that case of efficacy really get to the point where cities feel comfortable, going out to bid and providing a subsidy so these companies can stay afloat? I don't know if that's going to happen, but I wouldn't characterize it as they're looking to artificially inflate popularity statistics and then basically shove this on city government. I'll remind folks that 95% here in New York City, 95% of the market is personally owned micromobility. It's not bike share. City Bike's a great program. It's desperately needed here in New York City, but to say that City Bike's driving adoption would not be accurate.
We know equity is a huge issue in transportation. We have two equity related questions. One is from the Port Authority. Jay Sheffield asks about the potential mismatch between revenue sources and social equity. And then from our partner NPO, NIMTIC in New York, are the current trends in micromobility addressing the needs of families with small children, the elderly, and the disabled?
Okay, two great questions. The Port Authority question first. I think the reason why cities need to take a strong role in designing RFPs is so that we can have a citywide conversation about what are the needs of our communities. Right now, basically the paradigm that we're incorporating micromobility services in is basically permits. We're going to allow these companies to operate and we're going to give them an operation zone. I don't think that model is going to ever really produce efficacy that aligns with our needs as municipalities, because these companies, they're charging $5 to go 2 miles. You're just not, it's not competitive with public transportation. It's not competitive with walking. It's always going to produce an equity deficit. With Uni, 60% of our users are non-white. 25% are below AMI, at least, because a lot of them don't answer that question. And working cyclists are about 1 out of 5 of our users. So we know that equity is possible in terms of how we can introduce this kind of infrastructure. We know that there are 80,000 delivery workers who rely on bikes and scooters, not just to get to work, but to work. So we know that there's a strong constituency for efficacy, for equity here. It's just allowing these companies or allowing operators to align the bottom line with those equity goals. Now, how do you do that is the obvious question. I think New York City and other big cities have a really strong model. I'll list 2. Bus shelters and newsstands. New York City has 3,500 bus shelters. They're fairly evenly distributed within the context of the city. That's because New York City has a really strong advertising market, and New York City has really been, I think, quite cogent in how it approaches advertising-based public-private partnerships. So in the case of the JC2Co contract here, the city said, if you're going to get 4 bus shelters in Times Square, we need to get 10 out in East New York, right? If you're going to get 4 in Soho, we need to get 20 in the Bronx, because we understand how this works. The Lincoln NYC program, same model, right? If you're going to get 4 in Manhattan, we need 10 in Staten Island, right? So we've got fairly strong networks across the 5 boroughs of these services. Now, with City Bike, it's a little more challenging because City Bike is contiguous, whereas bus shelters and newsstands and and Wi-Fi kiosks aren't contiguous networks, right? So we see the sponsorship model kind of reaching its saturation point of how far it can expand before it no longer makes sense. But New York City, has made a decision not to subsidize City Bike even nominally, and so that then becomes a challenge. But there are ways to structure those kinds of agreements. So what I would contemplate is, instead of having a permit paradigm, we have a sole operator paradigm where one operator wins a contract and has to meet certain benchmarks to maintain that contract, very similar to how we award bike share contracts. And that way it becomes economically interesting for that company to make investments, not only in servicing neighborhoods across the economic spectrum, but also in infrastructure. Right now, if you've got, LA's got, I think, 10 operators, each one knows they could, there's no financial incentive to really take a long-term investment in that community, because why, right? You've got all these competitors. You're basically looking to stay afloat. You're not making any money anyway because the business model isn't sustainable. Now, in terms of the second question about access, I'm really encouraged. I'm really encouraged in the e-bike and e-scooter revolution. I'm also really encouraged just to see a conversation starting within many of our planning agencies around mobility lanes, micromobility lanes, and not just bike lanes, for two reasons. One, e-bikes and e-scooters really allow people who are traditionally not able to power a non-powered vehicle to take advantage of those mobility dividends. And so we can see, people who would be physically fragile, frail, disabled, really being able to use e-bikes as a way to go the distance, or use an e-scooter. Now, for those of us who are either elderly or otherwise, incapacitated, to have a chair that moves, a powered chair, to be able to use that wider micromobility lane, to be incorporated within that broader paradigm, is actually also very healthy, very exciting. So there's a lot of conversations here in New York City about, wait, who are bike lanes really for? And is bike lanes the right moniker for what is really space on the street for small mobility? And you're seeing the American Association for Disabled folks come out and say, no, bike lanes are important because if you're in a wheelchair that is electric, it's much easier to ride in the bike lane than it is to ride on the sidewalk, right? The surface is much smoother. You're not speed constrained. And so we can see this revolution really benefiting a broad constituency, not just people who are on bikes and scooters.
I'm just checking the chat box to see if there's any additional questions. Neil Weissman had a comment and posted a link, but I think that's it for the questions.
Can we open it up to the public? Anybody on the phone who may want to, well, in case somebody wants to think of another question and type it in. Meanwhile, maybe we have people who would like to ask a question on the phone.
I see in the chat box, Chair, that Trevor Howard, City of Newark, asked, what are the specs for a micromobility lane, travel lane?
I don't think there's a Bible for what a lane looks like. I mean, because I think so. When the bike lane when bike lanes started, being common in cities, and started planning bike lanes, they were often pretty narrow, because we designed them for one bike, maybe two bikes to ride alongside each other. And so 5 feet wide was not uncommon. Now we're starting to have a more nuanced conversation about what is micromobility, what is powered micromobility versus what is pedal micromobility. And it's become evident that we need to have maybe a passing lane. So you're going to have folks who are riding on powered micromobility devices that are going 20, 25 miles per hour. You're going to have folks that are pedaling, they're going 10 to 15 miles per hour, right? Is there enough room to pass? Is there enough room? Is there a shoulder to make a turn, right? And so typically I would, contemplate a micromobility lane, a bike lane, as being as wide as a car lane, going in one direction, so that there's ample room for people on wheelchairs, people who are riding e-bikes, but also people who are riding conventional vehicles. You want to have ample room for multiple speeds, and for all of the activities that one might expect to experience on the course of a trip, an average trip, right? Where if you stop and check your phone, you don't need everyone behind you to be screaming at you, right? You can pull over. So those kinds of contingencies need to be thought of as well. So typically a car lane is what I would contemplate it as, but I think the conversation is still very much in flux.
Thanks for taking time to answer these questions. If anybody else has additional questions, Mr. Stewart had posted his email. Perhaps we can follow up, so we're respectful of everyone's time.
Thank you for having me.